Previously in the complete creation.
It is because of their evolutionary preconceptions and dogma. I believe I've identified the trackmaker. Immediately, most people's minds reject this suggestion. Why? Because those rock layers are 350 million years old and ostriches had not yet evolved. Greetings and welcome back to part 13 of this exhaustive series of lectures on the creation-evolution debate. In the last lecture, we diverged from what I had scheduled to be covered, but I'm glad that I did, especially in light of some unexpected feedback I received from several who watched this series as it is being produced. In the last lecture, we dissected the evolutionary geological column into its individual components so we could assess fact from fantasy, as this geologic column, as presented to us, is nothing more than fantasy, but yet parts of it hold true in general. For example, in general, Jurassic rocks are found on top of Carboniferous rocks. This has nothing to do with ages, time, or evolution. In fact, the different types of rocks can be interpreted within a model of the global flood. In fact, such a sequence is best interpreted by different phases of a global flood encroaching upon the land and the different source rocks providing the sediments being eroded as the flood progressed, which explains the different types of sedimentary layers. I would say this is impossible to explain without a global flood. Do you remember the extent of those layers? Literally on every continent. How else are you going to get the same sedimentary layers on every continent on the planet? There really is only one explanation. It demands a global flood. Contrary to the evolutionary geologic column's depiction of the fossil order in the rock record, we see a mixing of fossils throughout the layers, and even a mixing of plants and animals from radically different environments. Saltwater and freshwater fish mixed with land animals and flying creatures, tropical and temperate plants, deep water fishes and shallow water fishes, along with insects. As we touched on last week, you get a mixing of fossils throughout the alleged fossil sequence, where this fictitious fossil sequence does not depict them, and indeed where evolutionary theory does not expect them. As we saw last week, just one fossil site alone in Nova Scotia yielded multiple fossilized bird tracks. Now, looking at the evolutionary fossil sequence, no birds are depicted down there. In fact, if evolutionary theory were to actually make predictions, like any real science would, it would predict that evidence of birds would never be found in rocks that old. So not only did we turn the fossil sequence upside down, but in the words of militant evolutionist Dr. Richard Dawkins, we blew the theory of evolution out of the water. And that was with fossils that were found. As we have also demonstrated, fossils of various organisms are absent from the fossil record where they should have been present. We know for fact that that organism was present on the Earth at that time, yet it does not appear where it is expected. The coelacanth and the Wollemi pine were two examples of many. So you cannot build up this fictional fossil sequence based on what fossils are absent from what layer. So the point I wish to drive home, though, is that this depiction of fossil sequence is demonstrated to be false in multiple ways. Yet, this fictitious fossil sequence is depicted and taught to this day, presented as fact, and it's not until you actually get out in the field and actually look at the fossil record that you find out just how completely opposite this fossil sequence is compared to real life. Let's take a very quick look at just a couple more examples of fossils that defy this fossil order as depicted. In the previous lectures where I showed the Joggins fossil cliffs, I frequently mentioned a common fossil called Calamites, a plant which is still around today in a much smaller form and known as Equisetum, or the horsetail rush. In the fictitious evolutionary geologic column and fossil sequence, that plant is only depicted in the Carboniferous. But this is far from the truth. As I previously mentioned, I found fossil Calamites in the Cretaceous Badlands of Alberta. But there they simply call them Equisetum. The subtle name changes of fossil organisms compared to their modern counterparts is frankly a devious tactic, which I will discuss in greater detail at a later date. Suffice it to say, giving a Latin name to a modern day organism and giving a different Latin name to the fossil of the exact same organism can only be described as dishonest at best. One could justifiably argue deliberate deceitfulness with the intent of blinding the minds of the readers into thinking that evolution has occurred, in that the two examples are identical in every way except their Latin name. In a 1953 Nature article by Jacob et al., they acknowledged other researchers who had reported finding fossil spores from Equisetalis, the horsetail rushes, in Cambrian rocks, along with their own findings of the same. Their research of these fossil spores from the Suket shales in India brought the list at that time up to 3 separate reports from 5 different investigators, all reporting the same discovery from multiple locations. Now, if you have spores from a specific plant in Cambrian layers, then obviously the plant had to have been around at that time, whether or not you find the remains of the stalk of the plant itself. They specifically stated in their paper that they were publishing their findings because of the skepticism expressed at finding spores in rocks so allegedly old, and that their hope was that others would now go and look in Cambrian rocks just as they had to discover spores elsewhere in the world in Cambrian rocks, and thus verifying what others were already finding. So that puts the horsetail rush, a plant still around today, throughout literally the entire Phanerozoic or fossil-bearing rock record. A complex plant that was not supposed to have evolved for hundreds of millions of years after the Cambrian. Now, if you want to be accurate, its depiction in the fossil sequence should look like this. Now, speaking of accuracy, before I go on, I have a correction I need to make that my good friend Brock Lee pointed out to me. The alleged evolutionary ages of the different layers in the graphic I had used had at least one error in it which I did not catch. Now, while the ages assigned to those different eras will vary depending on who you ask, I originally had the Cretaceous starting at 145 million years ago and switching to the Tertiary at 79 million years ago. I had compiled these alleged ages from generic sources and never caught the error because some had labeled some of the more spectacular dinosaur finds from the Hell Creek Formation in Montana as 78 million years old. But technically, the Cretaceous age wasn't supposed to have ended until around 66 million evolutionary years ago. I am aware that the Tertiary era is kind of being phased out and split into two eras called the Paleogene and the Neogene, and that they encompass the time span of 66 million evolutionary years to 1.8 million evolutionary years, subtly different than what I had. I will be specific, though frankly, this is an absolutely ridiculous correction to make because all of these ages are absolutely fictitious and just made up anyway. As you'll see later on when we get into detail on the dating methods, if we use the carbon-14 dating methods to date any samples from anywhere in this entire column, and I will provide you with a list of literally hundreds of tests that have been conducted throughout the entire Phanerozoic. So basically, everything you see in this entire column, any samples from anywhere in this entire column always return a carbon-14 age of between 5,000 and 50,000 years old. These numbers are ludicrous science fiction that were arrived at by arbitrary means based on the false assumptions of evolution and deep time. You can even see this historically. For example, in 1905, the Tyrannosaurus rex was considered 8 million years old. In 1927, it was considered 30 million years old. In 1941, the dinosaurs were claimed to be 140 million years old. Yet, modern carbon-14 dating methods applied to the dinosaurs or wood fragments found in dinosaur-bearing layers, like the Araucaria pine tree that I showed found in northwest Colorado, which still had originally preserved woody materials as well as coalified parts. All these samples return carbon-14 ages of between 5,000 and 50,000 years old. So, which is the correct age? 5,000 years old? 50,000 years old? 8 million years old? 30 million years old? Or 140 million years old? And just as crucial a question I would pose, why is the date that you chose the correct one? What makes you think it's the correct one? Because I know exactly which one is the correct one and why it is the correct one. I can give you the technical reasons, not some ad hoc, oh, we know the dinosaurs are millions of years old. No, we don't. In fact, we know for a fact that they are very young, thousands of years old. But, as I previously mentioned, I have personally studied and excavated fossil dinosaurs in 5 different American states and 3 Canadian provinces, and I have yet to see a date stamped on any of those fossil bones. And yet, the dinosaurs have been emblazoned in the minds of the public, and even worse, the minds of our children, as being proof of evolution. Now, whenever I give talks to kids, I always start off with questions like, when did the dinosaurs live? And invariably, the most common answer was millions of years ago. When I asked them, where do birds come from? Invariably, many of them would spontaneously say, dinosaurs. They have received full-fledged programming by multimedia to believe in evolution. Contrary to what many skeptics have assumed, the dinosaurs are not evidence for evolution in any way, shape, or form. What the dinosaurs and dinosaur bone beds do provide, though, is excellent evidence for a worldwide flood. When we do find dinosaurs, they are usually ripped apart, like we saw, but when they are found articulated, they are most often found in this death pose, with their heads pulled back as far as they can go. This is such a common find, it even has its own technical name, the opisthontonic pose. Coelophysis here from Ghost Ranch, New Mexico, is an excellent example of the opisthontonic pose. The head is pulled back as far as it can go. The arms and legs are shown convulsing. Even the tail is pulled back as far as it can go. This is Big Al, the Allosaurus. This beautiful reconstruction by Michael Berglund was done using forensic techniques. Now, you know where some forensic scientists, they have the skull of an unidentified person. So they take the skull, they lay clay on it and try to build flesh back onto the skull and reconstruct what the person looked like. He did the same thing here with the skull of a very famous skeleton named Big Al. This is what he came up with. Now, Allosaurus means strange, weird, or different. That's why I nicknamed this guy Weird Al. He's traveled a lot of miles with me in my van, got him from Vance Nelson, who owns the largest traveling creation museum in Canada. At any rate, this Big Al fossil skeleton was actually the second Big Al fossil found. So this guy would actually be called Big Al 2. He was found with his head pulled back in the opisthontonic pose. But it was not far from that spot where the first Big Al was found. These dinosaurs were excavated from the Howe Quarry, not far from Shell, Wyoming. Now, here's a map of the bones as they were found and excavated. As you can see, there's his head. The articulated remains of the first Big Al were also found in the death pose. I also have here a cast of what is probably the most famous fossil in the world, a critter named Archaeopteryx. It was made famous mostly because it was heralded as proof of evolution. It had many features that added credence to the dinosaur to bird theory, as it was seeming a mishmash of dinosaur and bird. For example, it has clear feather impressions, including on the legs. It has wings. If you look really close, it has teeth in its beak. It also has claws on its wingtips. Now, while that's very interesting, this has nothing to do with evolution. There are birds today which have claws on their wingtips, such as the ostrich, the Channa torquata, the cassowary, or the hoatzin of South America. There are also birds today like the tooth-billed hummingbird. 3 guesses as to why they gave it that name, and the first 2 guesses don't count. To this day, nobody knows what they use their teeth for. These are all true birds, and these characteristics have nothing to do with evolution. All this aside, Archie had a bad day. You can see that Archie was about the size of a chicken, but he is no longer the thickness of a chicken. He is now about the thickness of a chicken burger. Again, compressed under tremendous pressures, while the sediments were still soft, before the bird had a chance to rot, while the bones were still compressible. So again, rapid and catastrophic burial. But look at this, Archie is also in the death pose. Head pulled way back. Why? Now, when I say this is commonplace in the fossil record, I'm not joking. Let's take a quick look at a few examples. Here's another Archaeopteryx fossil. Notice the head pulled back in that classic death pose. Here's another Allosaurus from the Howe Quarry, where Big Al 1 and Big Al 2 were found. It was years before they managed to excavate the head, but there it was. The neck is again pulled back in the extreme. I don't know if this particular fossil is still on display or not at Dinosaur National Monument, as this was over 10 years ago when I took this photo. But again, head pulled back, and so is the tail, like it's under duress. The Black Beauty is truly a Black Beauty, a T-Rex on display at the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Drumheller, Alberta. Notice the head pulled back, tail pulled up, jaws open, as if it's gasping for air, suffocating. This particular Compsognathus has its head back and tail arched so far, its head is actually on its butt. Again, notice the position of the head, neck, even the legs, arms, and tail. Another classic example of an animal being buried while in distress. Head arched back as far as it can go, mouth gaping open, tail arched back. It's not just the dinosaurs, but other air-breathing creatures like this fossil bird we had previously seen from the Green River Formation. Notice the head pulled back as far as it can go. Notice the position of the head and neck, tail, the arms and legs. So just what is going on here? You see, these are all classic examples of an animal's response during asphyxiation and drowning. In fact, I have been told that ostriches, when they die, they pull their heads back. This was confirmed to me by ostrich ranch owners. And in fact, a chick pulling its head back was an indication it was sick. However, once the creature died, the muscles all relax and it could be found in any position. You, as a human being, when you are drowning or unable to properly breathe, you too pull your head back. This is one of the key things you can spot in a drowning person. Now, this placard from the Royal Tyrrell Museum was on display in 2010. I do not know if it is still there or not, and it doesn't really matter because it still serves well in the debate over the death pose. They expressed what was the conventional interpretation for the death pose. After death, this Ornithomimus body lay exposed under the hot Cretaceous sun. Theory suggests the flesh decomposed, muscles dried, and ligaments tightened, pulling the skeleton into a dramatically arched position. Soon afterwards, sediment buried the body, protecting its striking posture for millions of years. All right, let's dismantle this conventional thinking. There are numerous problems with this theory, which is directly contradicted by other interpretive plaques right in the very same museum. The same could be said at Dinosaur National Monument. The first problem with this theory comes back to some information you already know if you have been following along in this series. What's the most common fossil found in the dinosaur beds? Clams. This was no hot and arid environment. In fact, tour around the dinosaur museums and carefully read the interpretive plaques. Over and over again, you will see them referring to the dinosaurs dying in water. Now, they usually say a meandering river, but that's hogwash when you take a look at the actual evidence, because the dinosaurs are found with all kinds of sea life besides the clams. Sea life including saltwater sea life like rays and sharks, and even deep water fish like the coelacanth, which today lives hundreds of feet deep in the oceans. Finding the heavily armored ankylosaurs consistently buried upside down again smacks of death in water. Even the evolutionary paleontologists agree. The heavy armor plating acted like a big anchor, and the buoyant body of the dinosaur acted like a float to flip it upside down in the water. It subsequently died and was buried. The death pose also indicates death by asphyxiation, most likely drowning. This was the conclusion of evolutionary researchers Cynthia Fox and Kevin Padian back in 2007. They took the bodies of various birds and subjected them to soaking in salt water, drying them out. They even took beef tendons and dried them out. There was no response in the bodies or tendons. They concluded that it was the animal dying in stress and working its muscles that caused the opisthontonic pose, and acknowledged that drowning is one of the possibilities. I would contend that based on how and where the dinosaurs are found, it is the only possibility. In 2011, Alicia Cutler et al. From Brigham Young University presented a paper at the annual conference of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, detailing their research using the corpses of dead chickens. Drying the chicken bodies did not produce any movement, but dunking the dead chickens into cold water produced an immediate response, causing the bodies to take on the opisthontonic pose. So again, water is the culprit here. But it's not just dying by asphyxiation or even drowning. There's a second very important step involved here. The body must be rapidly buried to preserve the position from moving water, waves, or scavenger action. So the whole death pose, so common in the fossil record, is powerful evidence of mass death by drowning and rapid burial. As we saw previously, we know that the layers the dinosaurs are buried in do not represent some meandering river. The Morrison Formation covers 10 states and 3 Canadian provinces. That's some meandering river. Those dinosaur layers contain land, plant, and animal life, as well as deep sea life, buried together with the dinosaurs, which were killed by drowning and preserved by rapid burial. It is all powerful evidence for a global flood.
You can catch the entire series in a variety of ways. You can watch the show online at www.completecreation.org or www.genesisweek.com. You can also purchase the Complete Creation series in full high definition on Blu-ray or video on demand at completecreation.org. Or support the Miracle Channel with a monthly tax-deductible donation and access the entire Complete Creation series in high definition through Corco, Miracle Channel's video on demand service. We need your support to keep this program on the air. So please pray for us. And if you wish to financially support the program, Canadians can make a tax-deductible donation to Core Ottawa, Canada North Post Office Box 72075, Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, K2K2P4. Or you can make a donation via PayPal online at ianjuby.org/donations. And thank you for your support.